She lost 2 sons in one day, but her billionaire husband blamed her and divorced her. 2 years later, she came back with his twins. The billionaire froze mid-sentence in his board meeting when security called, "Sir, there's a woman here with your children." Impossible. His only children were dead, buried 2 years ago after the accident he blamed his ex-wife for. But the DNA results in Victoria's hand would prove that while he was destroying her life, she was growing his future. Before we get deep into the story, please let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Hit subscribe if you're hooked in and ready to enjoy this story, because tomorrow I have another beautiful story to share with you, and I don't want you to miss it for anything. Now, let's get into the story. The elevator's polished steel reflected Victoria Williams' face back at her, older now, weathered by storms that had aged her beyond her 32 years, but with eyes that still held the fire that had once made Jonathan Whitmore fall in love with her across a crowded charity gala. She adjusted baby Caleb against her shoulder, his warm weight a comfort against the anxiety clawing at her chest, while his twin sister Chloe stirred restlessly in the stroller, their dark curls catching the artificial light like tiny halos. 2 years. 2 years since she'd walked out of their penthouse with nothing but the clothes on her back, a broken heart, and a secret growing inside her that she hadn't even known existed yet. 2 years since Jonathan had stood in their marble foyer, his cold blue eyes cutting through her like winter wind, and delivered the words that had shattered what remained of her world. If you'd been watching them properly, if you'd been a better mother, they'd still be alive. The elevator climbed toward the 62nd floor, each soft ding a countdown to a confrontation she'd rehearsed 1,000 times, but still wasn't sure she was ready for. 23rd floor, where she'd first met Jonathan at the Children's Hospital Charity Gala, a young social worker in a borrowed dress who'd caught the eye of Seattle's most eligible bachelor when he'd called him out for writing checks instead of actually caring about the cause. She'd been fearless then, unimpressed by his wealth, drawn instead to the man she'd glimpsed beneath the polished exterior when he'd asked her with genuine curiosity what he could do to actually help. 31st floor, where they'd signed the lease on their first apartment together, a modest 2-bedroom in Capitol Hill that had felt like a palace compared to her studio near the community center where she worked. She remembered how he'd insisted on carrying her over the threshold, laughing when she'd protested that they weren't married yet. "Practice," he'd said, his eyes bright with love and possibility, "for all the thresholds will cross together." 48th floor, where she'd called him crying the day she found out she was pregnant with their first son, David. She'd been terrified, convinced that a baby would change everything between them, that he'd see her differently once she became a mother instead of just his girlfriend. But Jonathan had dropped everything, walked out of a board meeting, his assistant had told her later, and raced across the city just to hold her while she sobbed happy tears into his expensive shirt. "We're going to be parents," he'd whispered against her hair, his voice full of wonder. "We're going to have a baby." "Are you happy?" she'd asked, pulling back to search his face. "I'm terrified, but I've never been happier in my life." The elevator slowed at the 59th floor, and Victoria's chest tightened with the memory of what this floor represented. This was where it had all begun to crumble, where the money had started to matter more than the man she'd married, where Jonathan Whitmore, the loving husband and father, had slowly transformed into Jonathan Whitmore, the billionaire CEO, and where she'd learned that wealth could insulate you from everything except the thing that mattered most, the people you loved. She could still remember the night she'd come here to surprise him with dinner, 6 months pregnant with Marcus, only to find him in his office at midnight, screaming at some poor analyst about quarterly projections, while their son David slept in the reception area because the nanny had called in sick, and Victoria had been on a work conference. "This is your family," she'd said quietly, gesturing to their sleeping 6-year-old, "not your stock price."
Don't be dramatic, Victoria, he'd snapped, barely looking up from his computer. I'm providing for our family. This is how I provide. By missing David's bedtime stories? By being too tired to play with him on weekends? By treating me like the hired help instead of your partner? You're being unreasonable, he'd said, in that cold, dismissive tone she'd grown to hate. When you're ready to have an adult conversation about priorities, let me know. She should have known then, should have seen the warning signs, the way his love had conditions, the way he shut down when emotions got messy. But she was optimistic, naive maybe, believing that love could conquer anything, that having another baby would remind him what really mattered. Caleb made a soft sound in his sleep, and Victoria instinctively rubbed his back, the gesture as natural as breathing. These twins were her redemption, her proof that she could still create life even after watching it slip away. They were also her weapons, though she hated thinking of them that way. They were Jonathan's children, conceived in the last desperate weeks of their marriage when they'd clung to each other like drowning people reaching for driftwood, when they'd tried to save their relationship with passion instead of dealing with the cracks that were already too deep to heal. The elevator reached the 62nd floor with a whisper of expensive machinery, and Victoria took a deep breath, steeling herself for what was to come.
The doors opened to reveal the empire Jonathan had built, Whitmore Industries, with its floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Elliott Bay, its imported marble floors, its army of assistants and executives who moved through the space like well-dressed sharks. The air smelled of expensive cologne and fresh flowers, the kind of sterile perfection that money could buy. Nothing had changed, except everything had changed, because she was no longer the woman who belonged here. She was no longer Mrs. Jonathan Whitmore, the billionaire's wife who smiled for cameras and hosted charity luncheons and pretended that having everything meant being happy. "Ma'am?" The receptionist, a young blonde woman with the kind of polished perfection that screamed Ivy League and Daddy's money, looked up from her computer with barely concealed disdain. Her eyes swept over Victoria's simple jeans and sweater, the worn diaper bag slung over her shoulder, the stroller that had clearly seen better days. Everything about her expression said, "What is this person doing here?" Victoria almost laughed. 3 years ago, this same receptionist, or someone just like her, would have jumped to attention the moment she stepped off the elevator. Mrs. Whitmore's arrival would have been announced, coffee would have been offered, schedules would have been rearranged. Now she was just another person seeking an audience with the king. "Do you have an appointment?" the receptionist asked, her tone suggesting that she already knew the answer. An appointment? As if she needed permission to see the man who'd fathered her children, who'd shared her bed for 6 years, who'd held her hand through 2 pregnancies and 2 births and 2 funerals, and then decided she was the enemy when grief made him cruel. "Tell Mr. Whitmore that Victoria Williams is here to see him," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. The name felt strange on her tongue. Williams, her maiden name, the one she'd reclaimed along with her independence. "Tell him I brought something that belongs to him." The receptionist's perfectly manicured eyebrows rose slightly, her gaze flicking to the twins with something that might have been recognition. Victoria watched her process the information, the timing, the children's ages, the familiar curve of Chloe's nose that was pure Whitmore DNA. I'll call up," the receptionist said, her professional composure slipping just slightly. She picked up the phone with fingers that trembled almost imperceptibly. "Mr. Whitmore, there's a Victoria Williams here to see you. She says she has something that belongs to you." A pause, during which Victoria could hear the sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. "Yes, sir. She has 2 children with her. They appear to be very young."
The silence that followed was so complete that Victoria could hear her own heartbeat, could hear the soft sounds of the city below, could hear Chloe's gentle breathing as she slept. Then the receptionist hung up and looked at her with something that might have been pity. "He'll see you now. Corner office, through the double doors." Victoria nodded, pushing the stroller forward on legs that felt suddenly unsteady. This was it, the moment she'd been planning for months, dreading for years. She paused at the threshold of the double doors, looking back at the receptionist, who was watching her with undisguised curiosity. "For what it's worth, I hope he does right by you." The unexpected kindness nearly undid her. Victoria nodded, unable to speak past the sudden tightness in her throat, and pushed through the doors into Jonathan's domain. The corner office stretched before her like a monument to everything she had once shared and lost. Floor-to-ceiling windows framing the Seattle skyline, a desk that cost more than most people's annual salaries, leather chairs that probably had their own insurance policies. The walls were lined with awards and photos, Jonathan shaking hands with politicians, cutting ribbons at grand openings, accepting honors for his charitable contributions. But there were no photos of David and Marcus, she noticed. No pictures of the family he'd destroyed in his grief. Jonathan Whitmore stood with his back to her, his broad shoulders rigid beneath a tailored navy suit that probably cost more than her monthly rent. His dark hair was shorter now, threaded with silver that hadn't been there 2 years ago. And when he turned to face her, Victoria saw that the laugh lines around his eyes had deepened into something harder, more permanent. He looked older, wearier, like a man who'd been carrying a weight he couldn't set down. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence stretched between them like a chasm filled with everything they never said, everything they said that couldn't be taken back. Victoria watched his gaze move from her face to the twins, and she saw the exact moment when the color drained from his cheeks, when the carefully constructed walls he'd built around his heart began to crumble. His lips moved silently, forming words he couldn't quite say, and Victoria realized that for all his wealth and power, Jonathan Whitmore looked like a man who'd seen a ghost. Maybe that's exactly what she was. Victoria. Her name came out like a prayer, or maybe a curse, rough and broken in a way that made her chest ache with unwanted sympathy. She'd rehearsed this moment 1,000 times, standing in front of her bathroom mirror in the tiny apartment she'd rented with her divorce settlement money, practicing the words until they felt like weapons in her mouth. She'd imagined herself strong, composed, unbreakable. She'd imagined delivering her revelation with the cold precision of a surgeon making an incision. But now, faced with the reality of him, the way he still made her heart race even after everything, the way his voice still carried traces of the man who'd whispered love songs against her skin, the words seemed to crumble before they could form. "I came to return something that belongs to you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Jonathan's eyes fixed on the twins, and she watched him do the math. Caleb was stirring now, his tiny fist working against her shoulder as he woke from his nap, and Chloe had opened her eyes to reveal the same startling blue as her father's, a blue so distinctive that Victoria had spent the first months of their lives avoiding mirrors, afraid of the memories those eyes would trigger. "How old are they?" His voice was hoarse, like he'd been shouting, though Victoria knew he never raised his voice. Jonathan Whitmore destroyed people with quiet words and cold dismissal, with the kind of surgical precision that left you bleeding without ever seeing the knife. 15 months, she watched him calculate, watched the realization hit him like a physical blow. These children had been conceived during those last desperate weeks of their marriage, when they'd been fighting all day and clinging to each other all night, when they'd been trying to save something that was already dying.
when Victoria had been so broken by grief that she'd barely been functional, and Jonathan had been so consumed by blame that he'd forgotten how to be human. Are they? He couldn't finish the question, couldn't even say the word that would make it real. Yours? Victoria shifted Caleb to her other arm, the movement causing him to wake fully. His eyes, Jonathan's eyes, she'd noted with a mixture of love and resentment every day for 15 months, blinked up at her before focusing on the stranger across the room. What do you think? Jonathan sank into his chair as if his legs had given out, his hands gripping the armrests until his knuckles went white. For a moment, he looked exactly like he had the day they'd buried David and Marcus, lost, broken, barely holding himself together. But that day, Victoria had reached for him, had tried to comfort him, had needed him to comfort her. This time, she stayed exactly where she was. You were pregnant, he said, and it wasn't a question. His voice was flat, emotionless, but Victoria could see the storm brewing behind his eyes. You left, you were pregnant. I didn't know then. The lie came easily, because it wasn't entirely a lie. She'd suspected, but she'd been too broken to be sure, too shattered to care about anything beyond putting one foot in front of the other. The pregnancy test she'd taken 3 weeks later had been more formality than hope. She'd been so consumed by grief that she'd barely been eating, barely sleeping, barely existing. I found out 2 weeks later. 2 weeks, he laughed, but there was no humor in it, only a bitter recognition of cosmic irony. 2 weeks after you threw me out? Victoria's voice hardened, the carefully maintained composure cracking just enough to let the anger through. After you told me it was my fault our boys were dead? After you called me a failure as a mother and a wife? After you had your lawyers serve me divorce papers while I was still bleeding from losing our third child? The words hung between them like shards of glass, each one designed to cut. Jonathan's face went gray, and Victoria saw him flinch as if she'd struck him. Good. Let him hurt. Let him feel even a fraction of what she felt when she'd packed her bags while he was at work, when she'd left her keys on the kitchen counter and walked out of the only home she'd known for 6 years. You lost? Jonathan's voice broke on the words. You had a miscarriage? I lost everything, Victoria said, her voice steady despite the tears threatening to spill. I lost David and Marcus. I lost you. I lost the baby I was carrying, your baby, because the stress of losing my family was too much for my body to handle. I lost myself, Jonathan. I lost everything that mattered. And you were too busy blaming me instead of grieving with me. She watched the words hit him, watched his carefully constructed facade crumble piece by piece. For 6 years she'd loved this man, had believed he was her partner, her equal, her safe harbor in any storm. But when the worst storm of their lives had hit, he'd abandoned ship and left her to drown alone. I'm so sorry, Victoria. I'm so fucking sorry. Sorry doesn't bring them back, she whispered, surprised by how much it still hurt to say their names, even in her own mind. Sorry doesn't fix what you did to me. I know. He stood up abruptly, his movements jerky, uncontrolled. I know it doesn't, but I need you to know that I've regretted every word, every day since you left. I've hired investigators to try to find you. You've what? Victoria's head snapped up, fury blazing in her chest like a living thing. You've had me followed? I needed to know you were okay. I needed to know. You needed to know nothing. The fury was white-hot now, burning through her like fire. You gave that right up when you chose to blame me instead of grieve with me. You gave that right up when you let me walk out that door. You gave that right up when you decided your pride was more important than your family. I was wrong. The words came out in a rush, desperate and pleading. I was wrong about everything. I was angry and hurt, and I needed someone to blame, and you were there, and I'm sorry. I'm so goddamn sorry, Victoria. She wanted to believe him. God, how she wanted to believe him. But she'd learned the hard way that Jonathan Whitmore was very good at saying what people wanted to hear when it served his purposes. She'd seen him close million-dollar deals with the same earnest sincerity he was showing her now. "Why are you here?" he asked again, and something in his tone made her look at him more closely. She looked terrible, she realized. Older, thinner, like a man who'd forgotten how to take care of himself. "Why are you here? Really, if you hate me so much, why bring them here?" The question she'd been dreading, the one she'd asked herself every day for the past month as she'd planned this confrontation. Why was she here? Why risk opening old wounds? Why put herself through this torture? Victoria looked down at Chloe, who was playing with the buttons on her cardigan, completely oblivious to the storm raging around her. Such a simple question, and she wasn't sure she had a simple answer. "Because they deserve to know their father," she said finally. "Because as much as I hate what you did to me, I can't hate you for them. They're innocent in all of this." "And what about you?" Jonathan's voice was soft, careful, like he was approaching a wounded animal. "What do you want?" What did she want? She wanted her sons back. She wanted to rewind time and make different choices, keep David and Marcus inside that day, away from the drunk driver who jumped the curb and stolen their futures in an instant. She wanted the man she had married back, the one who'd held her hair when she had morning sickness and cried the first time he felt the baby kick. She wanted a world where love was enough, where good people were protected from senseless tragedy, where families stayed together when they needed each other most. But those were impossible things, and Victoria had learned to live in the world of the possible. "I want them to have what David and Marcus can't," she said, her voice stronger now. "I want them to have a father who loves them more than his money. I want them to have a chance at the family I thought we were building." Jonathan was quiet for a long moment, studying her face like he was trying to memorize it. When he spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. "Can I hold him?"
The question caught her off guard. She'd expected anger, or demands, or lawyers. She'd expected him to question whether they were really his, to demand paternity tests, to treat this like another business transaction to be managed. She hadn't expected this quiet vulnerability, this simple request that cut through all her defenses. "His name is Caleb," she said. "Caleb." Jonathan tested the name, and something in his expression softened. "After your grandfather?" Victoria nodded, surprised that he remembered. Caleb Williams had been the only father figure she'd ever known, the man who'd raised her after her parents died when she was 12. He'd been a janitor at the elementary school she'd attended, a quiet, gentle man who taught her that strength wasn't about power or money, but about showing up for the people you loved. "Can I hold Caleb?" Jonathan asked again. Victoria hesitated. This was it, the moment that would change everything. Once she let him hold their son, there would be no going back. They would be connected forever, not just by grief and anger, but by these two perfect little beings who carried the best of both of them. "He might cry," she warned. "He's not used to strangers." "I'm not a stranger," Jonathan said quietly. "I'm his father." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with promise and possibility, and the weight of all the ways this could go wrong. Victoria stood slowly, Caleb solid and warm in her arms, and walked around the desk. Jonathan stood too, his hands shaking slightly as he reached for his son. The moment their hands touched, transferring the precious weight between them, Victoria felt something shift. Not forgiveness, she wasn't ready for that yet, might never be ready for that. But something softer, something that acknowledged that this man, whatever his faults, was the father of her children. That these babies were the product of a love that had once been real, even if it had been destroyed by grief and pride and the terrible things people do to each other when they're drowning. Caleb looked up at Jonathan with curious eyes, and Jonathan stared back with an expression of wonder that Victoria remembered when David had been born, when Marcus had taken his first steps. This was Jonathan the father, not Jonathan the billionaire, and for a moment she could almost believe they might find their way back to each other.
"Hello, son," Jonathan whispered, and his voice cracked on the words. Caleb reached up with one tiny hand and grasped Jonathan's tie, his fingers wrapping around the silk with surprising strength. Jonathan's breath caught, and Victoria watched 20 years of carefully constructed walls crack just a little. "He's beautiful," Jonathan said, his voice thick with emotion. "They both are." "They're strong," Victoria said, settling back into the chair across from his desk with Chloe on her lap. "Stronger than I thought possible." And it was true. These children had saved her, had given her a reason to get up every morning when she'd wanted to disappear. They'd been her anchor in the storm, her proof that life could still create beauty even in the aftermath of tragedy. "Tell me about them," Jonathan said, still marveling at the way Caleb was studying his face. "Tell me everything, their first words, when they started walking, what they like to eat. I want to know everything I've missed." The request was so simple, so reasonable, and yet it felt like a knife between her ribs. Everything he'd missed. 2 pregnancies carried alone, 2 births without him holding her hand, 2 babies who'd never known their father's voice, their father's touch, 15 months of sleepless nights and first smiles and tiny milestones that she'd celebrated alone or shared with strangers in mommy groups who tried to be supportive but couldn't fill the hole where their father should have been. "Chloe walked first," Victoria said, her voice carefully neutral, "at 10 months. She's fearless, always has been. She'll climb anything, try anything. Caleb is more cautious, more observant. He watches everything, takes it all in before he acts." "Like you," Jonathan said softly. "Like you," Victoria corrected, "the way you used to be, before you became so focused on being right all the time." Jonathan flinched but didn't argue. "What else?" "Caleb's first word was mama. Chloe's was no. Make of that what you will." Victoria found herself almost smiling despite everything. "They love music, especially jazz. I play Ella Fitzgerald while I'm cooking, and they both dance in their high chairs." "Ella Fitzgerald," Jonathan repeated. "You always loved her voice." "I still do." Victoria's voice was softer now, remembering Sunday mornings when they'd cook breakfast together while Ella's voice filled their kitchen, when David and Marcus would spin around the living room in their pajamas, when love had felt like the most natural thing in the world. "Do they sleep through the night?" Jonathan asked, and Victoria could see him cataloging every detail, trying to build a picture of the life he'd missed. "Sometimes. Chloe has nightmares, night terrors actually. She wakes up screaming, and it takes forever to calm her down. The doctors say it's probably just developmental, but—" Victoria trailed off, unwilling to voice the fear that had been growing in her chest, that somehow, even in utero, Chloe had absorbed the trauma of those terrible weeks, the stress and grief that had nearly killed Victoria. "And Caleb?" Victoria said carefully, "Caleb has some delays, speech mostly. Motor skills are a little behind, too. We're working with specialists, doing therapy. He's making progress, but it's slow." "Is it—" Jonathan couldn't finish the question, but Victoria knew what he was asking. "Is it because of what I did to you? Is it because you were so stressed during the pregnancy that you couldn't take care of yourself properly?" "I don't know," Victoria said honestly. "The doctors say it could be anything. Genetics, environmental factors, just the luck of the draw. But I can't help but wondering." "Victoria," Jonathan's voice was barely audible. "What have I done?" The question hung between them, heavy with implications. Not just what had he done to her, to their marriage, to their family. What had he done to these innocent children who'd never asked to be born into the wreckage of their parents' love? "You did what you thought you had to do," Victoria said, surprising herself with the gentleness in her voice. "You were hurt and angry, and you lashed out at the person closest to you. It's human nature." "That's not an excuse." "No," Victoria agreed. "It's not. But it's an explanation."
They sat in silence for a moment, Watching Caleb explored Jonathan's face with the intense curiosity of a child encountering something new. He touched Jonathan's nose, his cheek, babbling softly in the way toddlers do when they're processing information. "Can I ask you something?" Victoria said, finally. Jonathan nodded, not taking his eyes off his son. "Do you ever think about them, David and Marcus?" The question hit Jonathan like a physical blow. Victoria watched him close his eyes, watched his jaw clench with the effort of holding himself together. "Every day," he whispered. "Every fucking day." "What do you think about?" "Everything." Jonathan's voice was raw now, stripped of its usual composure. "I think about the dinosaur book David loved, the one about T-Rex that he made me read 50 times. I think about Marcus learning to tie his shoes, how proud he was when he finally got it right. I think about how David wanted to be a paleontologist and Marcus wanted to be a firefighter, and how they'll never get to be anything now." Victoria felt tears sliding down her cheeks. This was the Jonathan she'd married, the one who'd loved their boys so fiercely it had sometimes taken her breath away. "I think about the last thing I said to them," Jonathan continued, his voice breaking. "It was, 'Be good for Mommy,' because I was leaving for work, and they wanted me to stay home and play dinosaurs. And I said, 'No, Daddy has to work. Be good for Mommy.' And that was it. That was the last thing their father ever said to them." "Jonathan, you know what the worst part is?" He looked up at her then, and Victoria saw the full weight of his guilt, the burden he'd been carrying alone for 2 years. "The worst part is that I blamed you for not being able to save them when I wasn't even there to try." The admission hung between them like a confession, raw and honest and devastating. Victoria felt something shift in her chest, a loosening of the knot of anger she'd carried for so long. "We were both there, but neither of us could save them. That drunk driver took them from us, Jonathan. Not me, not you, him. But if I'd been home, if you'd been home, you might have died too. Or maybe you would have sent them inside 5 minutes earlier and they'd still be alive. Or maybe you would have taken them to the park instead and some other tragedy would have found us. We can't live in the world of what if, Jonathan. I tried that for months and it almost killed me." Jonathan was quiet for a long moment, processing her words. Caleb had grown tired of exploring his father's face and was now trying to eat his tie, a development that would have been hilarious under other circumstances. "How did you survive it? How did you get through losing them and then losing me too?" Victoria looked down at Chloe, who was sleeping peacefully in her lap, her tiny hand curled around Victoria's finger. "I almost didn't," she said honestly. "There were days when I didn't want to get out of bed, didn't want to exist in a world where they didn't. But then I found out about the twins, and suddenly I had to survive. I had to take care of myself so I could take care of them." "Where did you go? What did you do?" "Portland," Victoria said. "I found a small apartment, got a job at a community center working with kids. It was hard at first. Being around children was painful, but it was also healing. I remembered why I'd chosen that work in the first place, why I'd wanted to help families stay together." Are you alone?" The question came out carefully, and she realized he was asking if there was someone else, another man who'd helped her through the dark times. "Alone," Victoria confirmed. "It was better that way. I couldn't trust anyone else not to leave when things got hard." The implication hung between them. He had left when things got hard, had chosen blame over support, anger over love. Jonathan's face crumpled with the weight of that recognition. "I'm so sorry. I'm so fucking sorry, Victoria. I failed you when you needed me most. I failed them. I failed myself. I don't know how to live with that." "You learn," Victoria said simply. "You get up every day and you try to do better. You honor their memory by being the man they would have wanted you to be." "And what kind of man is that?"
Victoria looked at him holding our son, this powerful man brought to his knees by 15 months of missed time, and felt something dangerous bloom in her chest. Hope, maybe. Or maybe just the memory of hope. The kind of man who puts family first. The kind of man who shows up when it matters. The kind of man who chooses love over pride, even when love is messy and complicated and doesn't come with guarantees. Jonathan nodded slowly, as if committing her words to memory. Can I try to be that man? Can I try to earn a place in their lives? The question she'd both hoped for and dreaded. Victoria looked at her children, David and Marcus's siblings, the babies who would never know their big brothers, but who carried their memory and their DNA, and made a decision that would change everything. "We'll see," she said finally. "But Jonathan, if you're going to try, you have to really try. No half measures, no backing out when it gets difficult. These children have already lost 2 brothers. They don't need to lose a father, too." "I understand," Jonathan said immediately. "Whatever it takes." "We'll start slow," Victoria said, her voice stronger now. "Visits, supervised at first, and therapy. For both of us, we need to deal with our grief, our anger, everything that went wrong between us. And if you ever blame me for something that's not my fault again, I'll disappear. And this time, you'll never find us." "I understand," Jonathan repeated. "Thank you for giving me this chance." "Don't thank me yet," Victoria said, standing up with Chloe in her arms. "Thank me when you've proven you deserve it." As she gathered her things, preparing to leave, Jonathan called her name. "Victoria?" She turned back to him, this man who'd been her husband, her partner, her greatest love, and her deepest wound. "I never stopped loving you," he said quietly. "Even when I was destroying us, even when I was being the worst version of myself, I never stopped loving you."
Victoria felt tears threaten again, but she blinked them back. Love isn't enough, Jonathan. I know that now. Love without respect, without trust, without the willingness to do the hard work, it's just a pretty word. "Then let me show you it can be more," he said. "Let me show you that I can love you the way you deserve to be loved." Victoria looked at him for a long moment, this man who'd given her the greatest joys and deepest sorrows of her life. "We'll see," she said finally, and walked out the door. But this time, she was walking toward something instead of away from it. This time, she wasn't running. This time, she was giving them all a chance to heal. Have you ever been so broken by loss that you pushed away the people who could have helped you heal? Sometimes we hurt the ones we love most when we're drowning in our own pain. What do you think? Can some betrayals ever be forgiven? Share your thoughts below. 3 weeks later, Victoria stood in the parking lot of Volunteer Park, watching Jonathan emerge from his black Tesla with the careful movements of a man who'd clearly spent the morning researching appropriate playground attire for divorced fathers. He'd traded his usual $1,000 suits for dark jeans and a navy polo shirt that probably still cost more than her grocery budget. But the effort was there. More importantly, he was there. 15 minutes early, carrying a diaper bag that looked like it had never been used. "You're early," she said as he approached, though her tone was more observation than accusation. "I didn't want to be late. I wasn't sure about traffic, and I thought maybe—" "Jonathan," she cut him off gently. "It's okay. Early is good." He nodded, looking relieved, and Victoria felt an unexpected pang of sympathy. This was uncharted territory for both of them. How do you co-parent with someone who'd broken your heart? How do you learn to trust again when the stakes are your children's happiness? "How are they?" he asked, his eyes finding Caleb and Chloe where they sat on a blanket under the shade of an oak tree. Chloe had spotted him and was clapping her hands, babbling something that sounded like "Dada," though Victoria wasn't sure if she actually associated the word with this man who'd been showing up once a week for the past month. "Good," Victoria said, settling onto the blanket beside her children. Chloe's been sleeping better. And Caleb, show him, baby. She held up a simple puzzle, and Caleb immediately crawled over, his movements still a little unsteady, but more confident than they'd been a month ago. He picked up a piece, a blue circle, and fit it carefully into the corresponding hole. That's new, Victoria said, unable to keep the pride out of her voice. His occupational therapist says his fine motor skills are really improving. Jonathan's face lit up like she'd just announced that Caleb had been accepted to Harvard. That's incredible! Can he do the whole puzzle? Not yet, but he's getting there. Victoria watched Jonathan settle carefully on the edge of the blanket, maintaining the respectful distance they'd established in these supervised visits. Can I? Jonathan gestured toward Chloe, who was pulling herself up on his legs with the determination of a child who'd recently mastered standing. Of course, she's your daughter. The words still felt strange in her mouth, but they were getting easier. Jonathan lifted Chloe carefully, and she immediately grabbed his shirt with sticky fingers, babbling in that particular way toddlers have when they're excited about something. She's gotten so big, he marveled, and Victoria realized that to him, these weekly visits were dramatic leaps in development. He was seeing his children grow in time-lapse, missing all the small daily changes that she documented obsessively in her phone. She's walking now. Well, sort of, more like controlled falling, but she's determined. As if summoned by their conversation, Chloe wiggled to be put down. Jonathan obliged, and she immediately took 3 wobbly steps toward Caleb before plopping down hard on her bottom. Instead of crying, she laughed, that pure, delighted sound that children make when they're proud of themselves. Victoria watched Jonathan's face transform with wonder, and for a moment, she could see the man she'd married, the one who'd spent hours on the floor with David and Marcus building elaborate block towers just so they could knock them down, the one who'd narrated every moment of their sons' lives like he was David Attenborough documenting rare wildlife. She's fearless, he said, and there was something wistful in his voice. She gets that from you, Victoria said without thinking, then immediately regretted it when she saw the pain flash across his features. Does she? Jonathan's voice was quiet. I haven't felt fearless in a long time. The admission hung between them, honest and vulnerable, in a way that the old Jonathan would never have allowed. Victoria found herself studying his profile as he watched their children, noting the new lines around his eyes, the way his shoulders seemed to carry a weight that hadn't been there before. What happened to us? She asked suddenly, the question escaping before she could stop it. Jonathan looked at her, and she saw him consider deflecting, giving her some corporate non-answer that said nothing and meant less. But then something in his expression shifted. I got scared, he said simply. Success was the only thing I knew how to do, the only language I spoke fluently. When David and Marcus died, when I couldn't fix it or buy my way out of it or intimidate it into submission, I panicked, and I took that panic out on the person I loved most. You blamed me because it was easier than admitting you were powerless. I blamed you because blaming you meant I didn't have to look at my own failures, because if it was your fault, then I didn't have to face the fact that I hadn't been the father they deserved, that I'd been so focused on providing for them financially that I'd forgotten to just be with them. Do you remember the last morning, before the accident?
Jonathan's face went pale, but he nodded. David wanted you to stay home. He'd built this elaborate dinosaur scene with his action figures, and he wanted to show you how the T-Rex was protecting the baby dinosaurs from the meteorite. But you had that conference call with Tokyo, and you said maybe later. I remember. And Marcus spilled juice on your shirt when he hugged you goodbye. You were annoyed because it was your lucky shirt for the presentation that afternoon. Jonathan's hands clenched into fists. Victoria, please. I'm not trying to hurt you, she said gently. I'm trying to make a point. We both have last moments we wish we could change. I wished I'd kept them inside that day,
Wished I'd been more paranoid about that curve in the street where cars sometimes drove too fast. You wished you'd stayed home. Wished you'd cared more about dinosaur stories than conference calls. Where are you going with this? I'm saying that guilt is a luxury we can't afford anymore. Victoria gestured to the twins, who were now both focused on the puzzle. Chloe helping by trying to eat the pieces, while Caleb patiently redirected her attention. They need us to be better than our guilt. They need us to be the parents David and Marcus would have wanted for their siblings. Jonathan was quiet for a long moment, watching his children with an expression Victoria couldn't quite read. When he spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. I used to lie awake at night after you left, thinking about all the things I'd never get to teach them. How to ride bikes, how to throw a baseball, how to treat the people they love with respect. I thought I'd lost my chance to be a father. You haven't lost anything yet, Victoria said, but you have to fight for it. You have to show up even when it's hard, especially when it's hard. I'm trying, Jonathan said. I know I'm not good at this yet, but I'm trying. I can see that, and she could. The diaper bag he'd brought was still pristine, but it was properly stocked with everything the twins might need. He'd remembered that Chloe liked the organic fruit pouches and that Caleb preferred his crackers broken into small pieces. Small things, maybe, but they mattered. Jonathan said carefully, can I ask you something? She nodded, though something in his tone made her wary. Are you happy? I mean, with your life now, the apartment in Portland, your job, are you happy? The question caught her off guard. Was she happy? It was such a simple question with such a complicated answer. I'm content, she said finally. I have work that matters, children who love me, a life that makes sense. That's more than I thought I'd have 2 years ago. But are you happy? Victoria looked at him, really looked at him, and saw the question behind the question. Are you happy without me? Is there room in your contentment for something more? I'm learning to be, she said honestly. Happiness feels dangerous now, like something that can be taken away without warning. So you don't let yourself want it. I don't let myself depend on it, Victoria corrected. There's a difference. They were interrupted by Chloe, who had abandoned the puzzle in favor of exploring her father's shoes. She was trying to untie his laces with the intense concentration of a toddler who'd discovered something fascinating. She's determined, Jonathan said, smiling as he gently redirected her attention to a toy. She gets that from both of us, the determination, the stubbornness. Sometimes I look at her and see myself at that age, convinced I could climb any tree or befriend any stray cat. And sometimes I look at Caleb and see David, the way he studies everything so carefully before he acts. David was like that too. It was the first time either of them had voluntarily brought up their lost sons in front of the twins, and Victoria felt something inside her chest both tighten and loosen at the same time. They would have been amazing big brothers. They would have spoiled these two rotten, Jonathan agreed. David would have read to them every night, and Marcus would have taught them how to build the most elaborate blanket forts. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, sharing the bittersweet ache of missing children who would never get to meet their siblings. But for the first time, the pain felt shared instead of isolating, a bridge between them instead of a wall. Jonathan, Victoria said eventually, I need to tell you something. His expression grew wary. What? I'm scared, she admitted. I'm scared of letting you back into our lives just to have you leave again when things get complicated. I'm scared of the twins getting attached to you and then losing another important person. I'm scared of trusting you and being wrong. What can I do? Jonathan asked immediately. How can I prove to you that I'm not going anywhere? Time, simply.
Consistency. Showing up not just for the good moments, but for the hard ones too. The tantrums and the fevers and the nights when they won't sleep and the days when nothing goes according to plan. "I want all of that," Jonathan said firmly. "The good and the bad and everything in between." Even when Chloe screams for 2 hours straight because she's overtired but refuses to nap, even when Caleb has a meltdown in Target because they don't have the specific crackers he wants, even when I'm exhausted and cranky and not particularly pleasant to be around. "Especially then," Jonathan said. "That's when families need each other most." Victoria felt tears prick her eyes. "The man I married used to say things like that. Maybe he's still in here somewhere. Maybe he just got lost for a while." "Maybe," Victoria said, but there was something in her voice that hadn't been there before. Something that might have been hope. Caleb had finished with the puzzle and was now crawling toward Jonathan with purpose. When he reached him, he pulled himself up to standing, using Jonathan's knee for support, and held up his arms in the universal toddler signal for "pick me up." Jonathan's face lit up as he lifted his son, and Caleb immediately snuggled into his chest, thumb finding his mouth in that particular way he did when he felt safe and content. "He trusts you," Victoria observed, and there was wonder in her voice. "Does he?" Jonathan looked down at Caleb, who was already getting drowsy in his father's arms. "Children are good judges of character. They know when someone is safe, when someone really cares about them. He wouldn't be this comfortable with you if he didn't feel secure."
Jonathan held his son closer, and Victoria saw tears gathering in his eyes. "I won't let him down," he said quietly. "I won't let any of you down. Not again." "Don't promise me that," Victoria said. "Promise them. When they're old enough to understand what promises mean, when they're old enough to hold you accountable, promise them that you'll be the father they deserve." "I promise," Jonathan said, his voice barely above a whisper, but Caleb seemed to hear him anyway. The little boy's hand came up to rest against his father's cheek, a gesture so innocent and trusting that Victoria had to look away. This was dangerous territory, this softening of her defenses, this willingness to believe that people could change, that love could heal even the deepest wounds. But watching Jonathan with their children, seeing the genuine tenderness in his eyes, she felt something she hadn't felt in 2 years. She felt like maybe, just maybe, they might find their way back to each other. But first, they had to learn how to be a family again. And that, Victoria knew, was going to be the hardest part of all. 2 months into their careful dance of supervised visits and tentative trust building, everything changed on a Tuesday afternoon that started like any other. Victoria was at the community center in Portland, leading a parenting support group for single mothers, when her phone rang with the distinctive tone she'd assigned to the twins' daycare. "Miss Williams, this is Rebecca from Little Sprouts. I need you to come pick up Caleb immediately. He's had some kind of episode, and we think he needs medical attention." The world tilted sideways. Victoria's hands went numb, her vision tunneled, and for a moment she was back in that hospital waiting room 2 years ago, listening to a doctor explain why her sons would never come home. "What kind of episode?" she managed to say, already grabbing her purse and keys. He collapsed. He was playing normally, and then he started shaking and fell down. He's conscious now, but he's not responding to us the way he usually does. We've called an ambulance." Victoria didn't remember the drive to the daycare, didn't remember the conversation with the paramedics, didn't remember anything except the sight of Caleb lying on a gurney, so small and pale that he looked like a broken doll. His eyes were open but unfocused, and when she called his name, he didn't respond. "We're taking him to Children's Hospital," the paramedic said as they loaded him into the ambulance. "Are you riding with us?" "Yes."
Victoria climbed into the ambulance, her hands shaking as she reached for her phone. She needed to call someone, Jonathan. She needed to call Jonathan. He answered on the first ring, which surprised her, until she remembered that he'd been answering her calls that way for weeks now, as if he'd been waiting for this exact moment. "Victoria, what's wrong?" "It's Caleb," she said, and her voice cracked on their son's name. "He collapsed at daycare. We're on the way to Children's Hospital. I don't know what's wrong. I don't know—" "I'm on my way," Jonathan said, and she could hear him moving, probably already heading for the elevator. "Which hospital?" "Seattle Children's. Jonathan, I'm scared. What if—" "Don't," he said firmly. "Don't go there. Not yet. We don't know anything yet." But Victoria's mind was already racing to the worst possible scenarios, to a future where she lost another child, where she had to bury another son. The paramedic was doing something with monitors and IV lines, speaking in medical terminology that she couldn't follow, and all she could do was hold Caleb's tiny hand and pray to a God she wasn't sure she believed in anymore. By the time they reached the hospital, Caleb was more alert, but still not quite himself. He looked at her with confusion, like he wasn't sure where he was or why these strangers were touching him. The emergency room was controlled chaos, nurses asking questions she couldn't answer, doctors ordering tests she didn't understand, forms that needed to be signed while her world fell apart around her. "Miss Williams?" A doctor with kind eyes and gray hair approached her in the waiting room. "I'm Dr. Martinez, the pediatric neurologist. We've run some preliminary tests on Caleb, and we think he had a seizure." "A seizure?" Victoria's voice was barely a whisper. "But he's never had one before. Is he going to be okay?" "Seizures in toddlers can be scary, but they're not always serious," Dr. Martinez said gently. "Sometimes they're febrile, caused by fever, and sometimes they're just developmental. We're running more tests to determine the cause." "What kind of tests?" "An EEG to check his brain activity, some blood work, possibly an MRI. We want to be thorough." I nodded, though I felt like I was drowning. Tests, more waiting, more uncertainty, more of the terrible, helpless feeling of watching your child suffer and not being able to fix it. "Victoria!" She turned to see Jonathan striding through the emergency room doors, his usually perfect hair disheveled, his tie askew, his eyes wide with the same panic she felt. He looked like he'd run from his car, and knowing Jonathan, he probably had. "How is he?" he asked, pulling her into his arms without hesitation. And for the first time in 2 years, Victoria let herself lean into his strength. Let herself be held by someone who loved Caleb as much as she did. "They think he had a seizure," she said into his chest. "They're running tests." She felt Jonathan's body tense, felt his arms tighten around her. "Where is he?" "They're getting him settled in a room. We can see him in a few minutes." Jonathan pulled back to look at her face, and she saw her own fear reflected in his eyes. But she also saw something else: determination, resolve, the kind of focused intensity that she remembered from their early days together. "We're going to get through this," he said firmly. "Whatever it is, we're going to handle it together." "What if—" "No what ifs," Jonathan said, echoing the words she'd said to him weeks ago. "Not until we know what we're dealing with." Dr. Martinez returned to lead them to Caleb's room, and Victoria felt Jonathan's hand find hers as they followed. The room was small and sterile, filled with monitors and equipment that made her chest tight with anxiety. But there, in the middle of it all, was Caleb, sitting up in a bed that was far too big for him, looking around with the wide-eyed curiosity that was so essentially him. "Mama!" he said when he saw her, reaching out with both arms.
Victoria rushed to him, gathering him against her chest, breathing in the familiar scent of his baby shampoo and the particular sweetness that belonged only to him.
He felt solid and warm and real, and for the first time since the phone call, she allowed herself to believe that he might be okay. "Dada," Caleb said, spotting Jonathan, and the word hit Victoria like a physical blow. Not because it hurt, though it did a little, knowing that she was no longer the only parent in their son's vocabulary, but because of the pure joy in Caleb's voice, the way his face lit up when he saw his father. Jonathan approached the bed carefully, as if he was afraid he might break something precious. "Hey, buddy," he said softly. "How are you feeling?" Caleb babbled something incomprehensible and reached for Jonathan's tie, his favorite fixation. Jonathan let him grab it, smiling despite the worry lines around his eyes. "The good news," Dr. Martinez said, consulting his chart, "is that Caleb seems to be back to his baseline. His preliminary tests look normal, and he is responding appropriately to stimuli." "And the bad news?" Victoria asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to hear it. "We need to figure out why this happened. Sometimes seizures in children with developmental delays can be related to underlying neurological issues. We won't know more until we get the test results back." "How long will that take?" Jonathan asked. "The EEG results should be available within a few hours. The MRI we're scheduling for tomorrow morning, and blood work takes about 24 hours for complete results." Victoria felt the world tilt again. More waiting, more uncertainty, more time for her imagination to conjure every possible worst-case scenario. "I'm staying," she said suddenly. "Victoria, you don't have to. I'm staying," she repeated, her voice stronger now. "I'm not leaving him alone in the hospital." "Then I'm staying too," Jonathan said, without hesitation. Victoria looked at him, surprised. "You have that board meeting tomorrow, the Morrison acquisition. You've been working on it for months." Jonathan's expression didn't change. "I'll reschedule." "Jonathan, it's a $50 million deal. You can't just—" "Watch me," he said, and there was something in his voice that brooked no argument. He was already pulling out his phone, typing rapidly. "Margaret, it's Jonathan. I need you to reschedule tomorrow's board meeting. Family emergency. No, I don't know when I'll be back. Handle it." He hung up and looked at Victoria with an expression she hadn't seen in years, absolute certainty about his priorities. "You just walked away from $50 million?" she said, still not quite believing it. "I walked away from a meeting. Money will always be there. Our son won't always need us this much." The words hit her like a revelation. This was the man she'd fallen in love with, the one who'd understood what mattered most. But more than that, this was the father David and Marcus had deserved, the one who would choose his children over everything else every time. "Thank you," she whispered. "You don't need to thank me for being his father. This is what fathers do." The next several hours passed in a blur of tests and waiting, of doctors and nurses coming and going, of taking turns holding Caleb while he napped fitfully between procedures. Jonathan proved surprisingly adept at hospital logistics. He somehow arranged for a cot to be brought to the room so Victoria could sleep, ordered food that was actually edible from a restaurant downtown, and managed to make Caleb laugh even while electrodes were attached to his head for the EEG. "You're good at this," Victoria observed, as Jonathan successfully distracted Caleb during a particularly uncomfortable procedure by making elaborate faces and sound effects. "I had good teachers," Jonathan said, and she knew he was talking about David and Marcus, about all the bedtime stories and scraped knees and childhood dramas that had taught him how to be a father. It was nearly midnight when Dr. Martinez returned with the EEG results. Victoria and Jonathan stood together beside Caleb's bed, their son finally sleeping peacefully after a day that had felt like a lifetime. "The EEG shows some abnormal activity," Dr. Martinez said gently. "Not necessarily cause for alarm, but it suggests that Caleb may have a mild form of epilepsy." Victoria felt the floor drop out from under her. Epilepsy? It's very manageable with medication, Dr. Martinez said quickly. Many children with mild epilepsy go on to live completely normal lives. With the right treatment, seizures can be controlled or even eliminated entirely. But he'll need medication? For how long? Jonathan asked, voice steady, but Victoria could see the way his hands were clenched at his sides. Possibly for several years. We'll monitor him closely, adjust dosages as he grows. The important thing is that we caught it early and that his development doesn't seem to be significantly affected. Victoria sank into the chair beside Caleb's bed, overwhelmed by a mixture of relief and terror. Not life-threatening, but not something that would just go away either. Another challenge for her son to face, another thing she couldn't protect him from. "Hey," Jonathan said, kneeling beside her chair. "This is manageable. This is something we can handle." "We?" Victoria looked at him, and for the first time the word didn't feel like a question. "We," Jonathan confirmed. "Whatever comes next, we handle it together." The next several hours passed in a blur of tests and waiting, of doctors and nurses coming and going, of taking turns holding Caleb while he napped fitfully between procedures. Jonathan proved surprisingly adept at hospital logistics. He somehow arranged for a cot to be brought to the room so Victoria could sleep, ordered food that was actually edible from a restaurant downtown, and managed to make Caleb laugh even while electrodes were attached to his head for the EEG. "You're good at this," Victoria observed, as Jonathan successfully distracted Caleb during a particularly uncomfortable procedure by making elaborate faces and sound effects. "I had good teachers," Jonathan said, and she knew he was talking about David and Marcus, about all the bedtime stories and scraped knees and childhood dramas that had taught him how to be a father. It was nearly midnight when Dr. Martinez returned with the EEG results. Victoria and Jonathan stood together beside Caleb's bed, their son finally sleeping peacefully after a day that had felt like a lifetime. "The EEG shows some abnormal activity," Dr. Martinez said gently. "Not necessarily cause for alarm, but it suggests that Caleb may have a mild form of epilepsy." Victoria felt the floor drop out from under her. "Epilepsy?" "It's very manageable with medication," Dr. Martinez said quickly. "Many children with mild epilepsy go on to live completely normal lives. With the right treatment, seizures can be controlled or even eliminated entirely." "But he'll need medication? For how long?" Jonathan asked, voice steady, but Victoria could see the way his hands were clenched at his sides. "Possibly for several years. We'll monitor him closely, adjust dosages as he grows. The important thing is that we caught it early and that his development doesn't seem to be significantly affected." Victoria sank into the chair beside Caleb's bed, overwhelmed by a mixture of relief and terror. Not life-threatening, but not something that would just go away either. Another challenge for her son to face, another thing she couldn't protect him from. "Hey," Jonathan said, kneeling beside her chair. "This is manageable. This is something we can handle." "We?" Victoria looked at him, and for the first time the word didn't feel like a question. "We," Jonathan confirmed. "Whatever comes next, we handle it together." The next several hours passed in a blur of tests and waiting, of doctors and nurses coming and going, of taking turns holding Caleb while he napped fitfully between procedures. Jonathan proved surprisingly adept at hospital logistics. He somehow arranged for a cot to be brought to the room so Victoria could sleep, ordered food that was actually edible from a restaurant downtown, and managed to make Caleb laugh even while electrodes were attached to his head for the EEG. "You're good at this," Victoria observed, as Jonathan successfully distracted Caleb during a particularly uncomfortable procedure by making elaborate faces and sound effects. "I had good teachers," Jonathan said, and she knew he was talking about David and Marcus, about all the bedtime stories and scraped knees and childhood dramas that had taught him how to be a father. It was nearly midnight when Dr. Martinez returned with the EEG results. Victoria and Jonathan stood together beside Caleb's bed, their son finally sleeping peacefully after a day that had felt like a lifetime. The EEG shows some abnormal activity, Dr. Martinez said gently. Not necessarily cause for alarm, but it suggests that Caleb may have a mild form of epilepsy. Victoria felt the floor drop out from under her. Epilepsy? It's very manageable with medication, Dr. Martinez said quickly. Many children with mild epilepsy go on to live completely normal lives.
Victoria pulled back to look at him in the dim light from the monitors. Partners? If you'll have me, Jonathan said quietly. Not just for the kids, Victoria, for us. I want to try again. I want to do it right this time. Jonathan. I know I don't deserve it, he said quickly. I know I hurt you in ways that might never heal completely. But these past few months, watching you with the twins, seeing the incredible mother you are, seeing how you've rebuilt your life from nothing, I've never been more in love with you, and I've never been more sure that you and the kids are all that matter. Victoria stared at him, searching his face for any sign of the man who'd blamed her for their tragedy, who'd chosen pride over love when she'd needed him most. But all she saw was honesty, vulnerability, and a love so deep it made her chest ache. I'm scared, she admitted. Me too, Jonathan said. But I'm more scared of not trying. I'm more scared of letting fear keep us apart when we could be facing whatever comes next together. And if things get hard again, if we face another crisis, another loss, what happens then? Then we hold each other up instead of tearing each other down, Jonathan said. Then we remember that we're on the same side, fighting the same battles. Then we choose love over fear, every single time. Victoria looked at Caleb, sleeping peacefully between them, his small hand curled around one of Jonathan's fingers. Their son, who would face challenges they couldn't predict, who would need parents who could work together to give him the best possible life. And she looked at Jonathan, who had proven over the past few days that he truly had become the man she'd needed him to be 2 years ago. Okay, she said quietly. Okay? Let's try, Victoria said, and felt something inside her chest unfurl for the first time in years. Let's be a family again. Jonathan's smile was brighter than all the monitors in the room combined. He leaned over Caleb to kiss her, gentle and reverent, like he was afraid she might disappear if he moved too quickly. I love you, he whispered against her lips. I love you so much, Victoria. I never stopped. I love you too, she whispered back, and meant it. I tried to stop, but I couldn't. I never could. They held each other in the narrow hospital bed, their son sleeping safely between them, and for the first time in 2 years, Victoria felt complete. Not because their problems were solved. Caleb would still have epilepsy. They would still have to navigate the complex grief of losing David and Marcus. They would still have to rebuild trust and learn how to be partners again. But because they would face it all together. Because love, real love, wasn't about avoiding the storms. It was about learning to dance in the rain. Sometimes the hardest part of healing isn't forgiving someone else. It's learning to trust them again after they've broken you. What do you think makes the difference between someone who's really changed and someone who's just saying what you want to hear? Share your thoughts below. Have you ever had to choose between protecting your heart and opening it to someone who could hurt you again? 6 months later, Victoria stood in the kitchen of their new house, not the penthouse, not her tiny Portland apartment, but something in between that belonged to all of them. The morning sun streamed through the windows she's insisted on, illuminating the controlled chaos of a Sunday morning. Caleb in his high chair, carefully stacking Cheerios while his seizure medication dissolved in his orange juice. Chloe toddling around with a sippy cup and trailing her favorite stuffed elephant. And Jonathan, still in his pajamas, attempting to flip pancakes while simultaneously reading a story about a brave little mouse.
The mouse said to the cat, "I may be small, but I have a big heart," Jonathan read dramatically, earning delighted giggles from both twins. Victoria smiled, watching him juggle breakfast and entertainment with the ease of a man who'd learned that the most important meetings of his life happen around kitchen tables and playground swings. 6 months ago, he would have been on his third conference call by now. Today, his phone was charging in another room, and his entire focus was on making sure their children started their day with laughter. "How did I do?" he asked, gesturing to the stack of golden pancakes, perfectly round and unburned, a far cry from his early attempts. "Getting better every time," Victoria said, and it was true about more than just his cooking. The transition hadn't been seamless. There had been arguments about Caleb's medication schedule, disagreements about whether Chloe needed a stricter bedtime routine, moments when old patterns threatened to resurface, but they'd learned to fight differently now, as partners rather than adversaries, with the shared goal of building something better than what they'd lost. "Mama," Caleb called, holding up a tower of 3 Cheerios with the pride of an architect unveiling his masterpiece. "That's beautiful, baby," Victoria said, dropping a kiss on his head. His seizures were well controlled now, occurring only rarely with medication adjustments made in consultation with Dr. Martinez. He was still behind on some developmental milestones, but he was making steady progress, and more importantly, he was happy. "Dada, more story!" Chloe demanded, climbing onto Jonathan's lap with the determination of a child who knew exactly what she wanted. "More story, coming right up. But first, pancakes." They settled around the table they'd picked out together, not the formal dining set from the penthouse, but something warm and lived in that could withstand syrup spills and crayon marks. Victoria watched her family eat breakfast, marveling at how normal it all felt, how right. This was what she dreamed of during those dark months in Portland, what she thought was lost forever. "I have something for you," Jonathan said, reaching into his pocket and pulling out an envelope. I raised her eyebrow. "It's not my birthday. Just open it." Inside the envelope was a single sheet of paper, a deed to a plot of land in Woodland Cemetery, where a simple granite headstone bore the names David James Whitmore and Marcus Alexander Whitmore, beloved sons and brothers. I know we never talked about where to bury them. I made that decision alone, and I shouldn't have. But I thought maybe we could visit them together now, as a family.
Victoria felt tears slip down her cheeks. For 2 years, she hadn't been able to bring herself to visit their graves, had been too angry at Jonathan for excluding her from the burial decisions, too broken to face the reality of their small bodies in the ground. "I'd like that," she whispered. "There's something else." Jonathan pulled out his phone and showed her a website. "I've been working with an architect. I want to build a playground in their memory. Not just a memorial, but something living, something that brings joy to other children." Victoria studied the plans, seeing swings and slides and climbing structures designed with the kind of attention to safety that came from a father who'd learned too late how precious and fragile childhood was. "David would have loved the dinosaur sandbox," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "And Marcus would have conquered that climbing wall in about 5 minutes," Jonathan agreed. They spent the rest of breakfast talking about the playground, about the David and Marcus Foundation that was already funding childhood safety programs across the state, about how to honor their lost sons while celebrating the children they still had. It was still painful, but it was a different kind of pain now. The sweet ache of love that endures, rather than the sharp cut of anger and blame. After breakfast, while the twins napped, Victoria found herself standing in the nursery they'd created together. Unlike the formal, expensive nursery from the penthouse, this room was warm and welcoming, filled with books and toys and pictures of their growing family. On the dresser sat a framed photo from David's 6th birthday party and another from Marcus's 4th, right next to recent pictures of Caleb taking his first unsteady steps and Chloe laughing in a pile of autumn leaves. "Regrets?" Jonathan asked, appearing in the doorway. "About what?" "This house, this life, giving me another chance.
He leaned against the doorframe, and Victoria could see the vulnerability in his expression, the fear that she might realize she'd made a mistake. "No regrets," she said firmly. "Not about this. Even when I mess up, even when I forget to ask before making decisions or when I get too focused on work? Especially then, because now you notice when you mess up. Now you apologize and do better. The man I married the first time thought he was perfect. The man I'm with now knows he's not, and he tries to be better anyway." Jonathan pulled her into his arms, holding her close. "I want to marry you again," he said suddenly. Victoria looked up at him, surprised. "What?" "I want to marry you again, not because we have to, not because of the kids, but because I want to, because I want to make promises to you that I know how to keep now." "What kind of promises?" "I promise to show up," Jonathan said, his voice steady and sure. "Not just physically, but emotionally. I promise to put you and the kids first, even when it's hard, even when it costs me business deals or social standing or whatever else I used to think mattered." Victoria felt tears gathering in her eyes. "Jonathan, I promise to be vulnerable with you," he continued, "to let you see me when I'm scared or hurt instead of pushing you away. I promise to trust you with my weaknesses instead of pretending I don't have any." "Those are big promises." "I'm a different man than I was when I made promises the first time. I know what it means to lose the people you love most. I know what it costs to choose pride over love. And I know that I'd rather be vulnerable with you than safe without you." Victoria looked at him, really looked at him, and saw the truth in his eyes. This wasn't the man who'd blamed her for their tragedy, who'd chosen control over connection. This was a man who'd been broken and rebuilt himself piece by piece, who'd learned that strength came not from protecting yourself from pain, but from facing it with the people you loved. "Ask me again in a year," she echoed the words she'd said months ago. "What?" Jonathan's face fell slightly. "I'm kidding," Victoria said, laughing at his expression. "Yes, Jonathan. Yes, I'll marry you again. Yes, I want to build a life with you. Yes to all of it." Jonathan's smile was radiant as he spun her around the nursery, both of them laughing like teenagers. They were interrupted by Chloe calling from her crib, having woken from her nap. And they rushed to get her before she woke Caleb too. "Mama, Dada," Chloe said happily, reaching for both of them. "Hi, baby girl," Victoria said, lifting her daughter. "Did you have sweet dreams?" Chloe babbled something incomprehensible but joyful, and Victoria felt her heart swell with gratitude for this moment, for this second chance, for the family they'd rebuilt from the ashes of their grief. That evening, after the twins were asleep, and they were sitting on the couch sharing a bottle of wine, Victoria found herself thinking about the woman she'd been 2 years ago. Broken, angry, convinced that love was just another word for the pain people inflicted on each other when they stopped trying. "What are you thinking about?" Jonathan asked, his arm tightening around her shoulders. "Just everything. How different it all is now. Better?" "Different," Victoria said. The same answer she'd given him months ago, but now it felt like a celebration instead of a question mark. "I've been thinking too," Jonathan said, "about David and Marcus, about what they'd think of all this." Victoria turned to look at him, surprised by the peace in his expression when he mentioned their lost sons. "I think they'd be proud of us," he continued. "I think they'd be happy that their siblings have parents who love each other, who've learned how to fight for their family instead of fighting with each other." "I think so too," Victoria said softly. "I think they'd love being big brothers, even from wherever they are now." "I want to tell Caleb and Chloe about them," Jonathan said, "when they're old enough to understand. I want them to know they had brothers who loved them before they were even born." Victoria felt tears slide down her cheeks, not tears of grief this time, but tears of gratitude. "I'd like that too." They sat in comfortable silence, holding each other in the home they'd built together, their children sleeping safely upstairs. Outside, Seattle glittered in the darkness, all possibility and promise. And inside, a family that had been shattered was whole again, not because their pain was gone, but because they'd learned to carry it together. 3 months later, on a crisp autumn day that reminded Victoria of the morning she'd first walked into Jonathan's office with 2 babies and a heart full of anger, they stood in the same small chapel where they had buried David and Marcus. But this time they were there to celebrate life, to make promises they knew how to keep.
The ceremony was small, just immediate family and a few close friends. Chloe toddled down the aisle, scattering flower petals with more enthusiasm than accuracy, while Caleb was carried by Victoria's best friend, his eyes wide with wonder at all the flowers and candles. Do you, Jonathan, take Victoria to be your wife, to love and honor and cherish, in sickness and in health, in grief and in joy, for all the days of your life? The minister asked. I do, Jonathan said, his voice strong and sure, his eyes never leaving Victoria's face. Do you, Victoria, take Jonathan to be your husband, to love and honor and cherish, in sickness and in health, in grief and in joy, for all the days of your life?
Victoria looked at this man who'd broken her heart, and then spent months proving he could be trusted with it again, who'd chosen their family over every business deal and social obligation, who'd learned to be the father their children deserved and the partner she'd always needed. I do, she said, and meant it with every fiber of her being. As they kissed to seal their new beginning, Victoria felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the autumn sun streaming through the chapel windows. She felt the presence of the children they'd lost and the children they'd found, the love they'd destroyed and the love they'd rebuilt, the family they'd been and the family they were becoming. Later, at the reception in their backyard, as she watched Jonathan carefully helping Caleb blow out candles on a cake he probably couldn't eat much of, as she watched Chloe charming every guest with her infectious giggle, Victoria realized that this was what happiness looked like. Not the absence of sorrow, but the presence of love strong enough to coexist with it. Any regrets? Jonathan asked, appearing at her side with 2 glasses of champagne. Just one, Victoria said, accepting the glass. Jonathan's face fell. What? That it took us so long to figure this out, Victoria said, smiling at his relief. That we wasted 2 years being apart when we could have been healing together.
Maybe we needed that time, Jonathan said thoughtfully. Maybe we needed to be broken apart before we could be put back together the right way. Maybe, Victoria agreed, but I'm grateful we found our way back to each other. To second chances, Jonathan said, raising his glass. To love that's stronger than fear, Victoria replied. To our family, they said together, and drank to a future that was uncertain but no longer frightening, because whatever came next, they would face it together. As the sun set over their celebration, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose, Victoria looked around at the life they'd built from the ruins of their first marriage. It wasn't perfect. Caleb would always have epilepsy. They would always grieve for David and Marcus. They would always be learning how to love each other better. But it was real, and it was theirs, and it was enough. More than enough. It was everything. Victoria had lost 2 sons in one day. She'd lost her husband to grief and blame. She'd lost herself to anger and despair. But she'd found her way back to love, back to family, back to the belief that sometimes the best endings are the ones you have to fight for. And in the end, the fight had been worth everything. Love isn't about avoiding the storms. It's about learning to dance in the rain together. Sometimes the strongest families are the ones that have been broken and rebuilt with stronger foundations.
Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you enjoyed this story, you will surely love the next one. It's as crazier and more intriguing as you can ever imagine. So do check it out. Click on the image showing on your screen right now to watch the next one.